Hi, I'm David Miller, and this is the ninth and final mini-lecture in the series on Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Today we're concentrating on the last movements of Volume 3, and we're going to talk about closing the distance. And we ended last time by noticing that Elizabeth was humbled. It happens twice. First, when Wickham and Lydia are married, and again in the third movement, when Mrs. Gardner's letter makes it clear to Elizabeth just how much Darcy has done to rescue her family's honor. Even as the letter from Mrs. Gardner confirms Lizzie's humiliation, it begins to offer her grounds for some hope. Her heart did whisper that he had done it for her. For herself she was humbled, but she was proud of him. It's a faint hope at first, just a whisper. But when Bingley comes back to Netherfield, renewing his courtship of Jane, he brings Darcy with him, and this renews Elizabeth's hopes as well. By now, however, she is almost as tongue-tied as Darcy by the combined feelings of passion, fear, and shame, and they barely manage any conversation at all before he returns to London. The secondary couples serve to provide points of contrast for the main courtship. Lydia and Wickham, restless, where Elizabeth and Darcy are restrained. Bingley and Jane, simply and spontaneously affectionate, where Darcy and Elizabeth are proud and judgmental. These contrasting courtships also serve to heighten the drama. The marriage of Lydia to Wickham brings Elizabeth and Darcy closer, even while it seems to raise the bar between them. The renewal of Bingley's courtship of Jane brings Darcy and Elizabeth together, only to emphasize the barriers that prevent them from speaking to each other. Now, it's because Lady Catherine pushes Elizabeth and Darcy beyond this impasse that I call her the trigger. She opens the fourth movement by coming to Longbourn to reimpose the bar between them by an act of her own imperious will. The paradox of Lady Catherine's intervention reflects that of the bar. If the thing that holds the lovers apart raises the pitch of their passion, then the thing that tries to separate them once and for all should bring them finally together. So it is with Lady Catherine. By insisting on Elizabeth's no, she precipitates Elizabeth's yes. It's when Darcy learns that Elizabeth has refused his aunt's demand for her no that his hopes are rekindled as well. By the time Lizzie has endured one final mortification at the hands of her well-meaning father, who insists on sharing with her his amusement over the letter from Mr. Collins, Darcy is already on the road from London, and the happy ending is in sight. At this point, we are already moving toward the denouement. Lizzie must still convince Jane and Mr. Bennet that she really does love Darcy. These conversations hark back to the narrator's earlier assessment of her motives at the close of the first movement, signaling, by this symmetry, that the pattern is coming full circle. Another sure sign that the story is coming round to its close is the return of humor. Some of the most purely enjoyable lines in the novel are found in these final chapters. For example, after Elizabeth has convinced her father that she really loves Darcy, he concludes the interview by laughing at her and saying, "If any young men come for Mary or Kitty, send them in, for I am quite at leisure." This moment is significant because his effort to amuse Elizabeth with the letter from Mr. Collins had been such a decided failure in chapter 15. Never, said the narrator, had his wit been directed in a manner so little agreeable to her. But after Darcy proposes in chapter 16, Lizzie gets her mojo back. The chapter ends with her barely restraining the temptation to tease Darcy. She remembered that he had yet to learn to be laughed at, and it was rather early to begin. And the next chapter finds her back in good form when Jane exclaims, "Oh, Lizzie, it cannot be. I know how much you dislike him." Lizzie replies, "Perhaps I did not always love him as well as I do now, but in such cases as these, a good memory is unpardonable. This is the last time I shall ever remember it myself." Just consider how much of the novel has been focused on remembering the past in order to correct wrong impressions, and how intense that process has been. The ability now to joke about it signals a release of tension. Signals like these prepare us for the denouement. When it arrives, it provides a satisfying sense of closure. It unites the lovers in marriage. It completes the symmetry of Volume 3 by returning the action to Pemberley. And in the final chapter, it turns the story back over to the voice of the narrator, describing the happiness of the wedded couples in the assured tones proper to the omniscient point of view. Earlier, you remember we looked in some detail at the way distance works as a highly complex symbol in Pride and Prejudice. You remember the scene where, in just the space of a few lines, Austen manages to show how distances of all kinds are knotted together in the subjective experience of her characters. There was the distance by coach from Hertfordshire to Hunsdon, the economic difference between wealth and modest means, the social and psychological distance between men with their freedom of movement and women enclosed in their houses and parlors. There's the difference between entering a room and entering someone's personal space by moving your chair a few inches. There's the emotional and geographical distance between a married daughter and her birth family. And there is the emotional distance between two persons who do not understand each other. All these overlap and reinforce each other in that brief scene. You can probably think of other moments in the first two volumes that explore the different dimensions in which individuals approach one another or draw apart. There is Lizzie's uncharacteristic march to Netherfield when Jane falls ill, crossing fields and fences in her determination. There is Miss Bingley's invitation to Elizabeth to walk about the dining room with her, and Darcy's teasing refusal to join them. Just a few pages before the scene at the parsonage, there is Darcy's approach to Elizabeth, who has sat down to play the pianoforte at Rosings. She asks, "You mean to frighten me, Mr. Darcy, by coming in all this state to hear me?" And there is the flirtatious reply from Darcy that ends this conversation by implicitly bringing Elizabeth and himself together. "We neither of us perform to strangers," he tells her with a smile. I mentioned earlier that as Volume 2 ends, Elizabeth is asking her father to be more assertive, and that she views him with more objectivity, more distance, when he declines. Here, the movement foreshadowed in Darcy's earlier attempt to draw close and to draw Elizabeth away from her family is beginning to unfold. Elizabeth is gaining greater emotional and psychological distance on her home and family, drawing apart from them as she takes Darcy's perspective into herself and makes it her own. I'm sure you remember these images from an earlier lecture. Volume 3 develops this pattern with great care. Elizabeth's visit to Pemberley closes the geographical distance Darcy was worried about, bringing her from Longbourn to Derbyshire, from her father's house to his house. In one sense, of course, this foreshadows her journey from the role of daughter to that of wife, the journey that brings her back to Pemberley at the close of Volume 3. But her passage to the interior of Darcy's home is also, as we saw, a movement of comprehension, beginning at the edge of the grounds, approaching the house, entering downstairs, and moving upstairs to encounter his portrait. Elizabeth's psychological process mirrors the growth in her knowledge of Darcy's character. Now, I don't want to go through every scene in Volume 3 tracking this kind of movement. I think you get the idea. Let's just notice that when Darcy returns to Longbourn with Bingley, physical movements on a very small scale once again provide a kind of index to social, psychological, and emotional forms of approach and retreat. On the walk, when Darcy is about to propose a second time, he and Elizabeth go as far as Lucas Lodge with Kitty. When she turns in there, Elizabeth went boldly on with him alone. It doesn't say that she goes boldly on where no romance heroine has gone before, but that's only because Austen's style is so understated. After Darcy proposes and Elizabeth accepts, they walked on without knowing in what direction. But we know where they're headed, toward a closing of all the distances between love and property, love and judgment, individuality and omniscience, pride and prejudice, toward the final words of the novel, uniting them in the vanishing point of companionate marriage.